The snow was deep, the kind that swallowed sound and turned the world into a silent, frozen abyss. Alex Carter, a veterinarian who had long traded the city's chaos for the wilderness of British Columbia, moved cautiously through the dense forest. His boots crunched over the frost-covered ground as he adjusted his rifle strap, not out of fear of predators, but for the sheer unpredictability of the wild. It was a routine check of the remote land he called home, a daily patrol, ensuring the balance of nature remained undisturbed. But today, something was wrong. The air carried an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional rustling of the trees under the burden of snow. Then he heard it, a sound that sent ice through his veins. A low, agonized whimper. It was faint, nearly swallowed by the thick blanket of white, but unmistakable. An animal in pain. Alex followed the sound, his heart hammering as he navigated the undergrowth, his gloved hands brushing aside brittle branches. He was no stranger to the cruelty of the wilderness. Animals injured, trapped, suffering at the hands of unseen dangers. But as he crested a small ridge, the sight that met his eyes made his breath hitch. There, half buried in snow, was a she-wolf. The creature's fur, a striking mix of silver and ash, was matted with blood. One of her front legs was ensnared in a steel trap, a barbaric relic of human intervention in the wild. The sharp, jagged teeth of the mechanism had bitten deep into her flesh, and Alex could see where she had struggled violently, trying to free herself. The snow around the trap was churned and stained crimson. His stomach twisted. This was no ordinary wolf, she was pregnant. Her swollen belly heaved with each shallow breath, her ribs visibly expanding and contracting as she fought against exhaustion. Her eyes, golden and wild, locked onto his with a mixture of terror and defiance. She bared her fangs weakly, a last, desperate attempt to appear dangerous despite her helplessness. Alex had encountered wolves before. He respected them, admired their resilience. But this was different. This was a mother, and she was dying. He crouched slowly, his movements calculated. His mind worked rapidly, weighing the risks. A wolf, even one in distress, was still a formidable creature. One snap of her jaws, and he'd be nursing a shredded arm. But there was no choice. If he left her here, she would bleed out or fall victim to the cold. Or worse, her pups would die inside her. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice low, soothing. The she-wolf flinched, but did not lunge. She was too weak for that now. Her eyes flicked to his hands as he reached into his pack, pulling out a thick, insulated blanket. The wind howled through the trees, shaking snow from the branches above as he moved closer. His heart pounded against his ribs. The moment his fingers brushed her fur, she growled, a hoarse, broken sound. It wasn't a threat, it was fear. "I know," Alex whispered. "I know it hurts." She trembled, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He worked quickly, draping the blanket over her to offer some semblance of warmth before turning his attention to the trap. His gloved fingers traced the rusted metal, jaw clenched with fury. Poachers. He despised them. This was their work. Careless, merciless. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small crowbar. His hands were steady, but inside, he was bracing for the inevitable moment the she-wolf lashed out. "Hold on, girl. I'm getting you out." With precise movements, he wedged the crowbar into the trap's hinge and pushed down with all his strength. The trap resisted, unwilling to release its prey. He gritted his teeth, pouring his weight into it. A sharp metallic snap filled the air. The she-wolf yelped, her entire body seizing as the pressure on her mangled leg disappeared. Alex barely had time to react before pain exploded in his arm. Her teeth sank into his forearm, through his thick jacket, through muscle, through skin. The instinctive retaliation of an animal that had known only suffering. His vision swam as he clenched his jaw, suppressing a cry. He didn't pull away, that would only worsen the damage. "Damn it, girl," he hissed through gritted teeth. Then, just as suddenly as she had attacked, she released him. She collapsed into the snow, chest heaving, her strength spent. Alex exhaled sharply, pressing his free hand to the bleeding wound on his arm. He didn't have time to assess the damage. The she-wolf was still alive, but for how long? Blood oozed from the deep gashes in her leg, seeping into the snow like ink in water. Adrenaline surged through his veins as he pulled out a roll of gauze and antiseptic. He worked fast, wrapping the wound with practiced efficiency. The she-wolf whined, but didn't resist. She was fading. Alex knew he couldn't leave her here. She wouldn't survive the night. But bringing a wild, injured, pregnant wolf into his home? It was insanity. He glanced down at her, her massive form trembling beneath the blanket. The life growing inside her was at risk, and Alex had spent too many years fighting for animals to abandon one now. Making up his mind, he carefully slid his arms under her body. She barely stirred as he lifted her, cradling her weight against his chest. Her fur was damp with melted snow, her blood soaking into his clothes. He adjusted his grip, feeling the steady but faint rhythm of her heartbeat against him. "Let's get you somewhere warm," he murmured. The walk back to his cabin was grueling. The wind bit at his exposed skin, his injured arm screamed in protest, and his breath came in harsh clouds. But he didn't stop. By the time he reached the front steps, his legs were on the verge of buckling. He nudged the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside, warmth washing over him. Carefully, he lowered the she-wolf onto the thick pile of blankets near the fireplace. She whimpered softly, her body curling in on itself. Alex sank onto his knees beside her, ignoring the searing pain in his arm. His cabin was small but sturdy, a sanctuary against the harsh wilderness. Now it was a makeshift hospital. He reached out hesitantly, brushing his fingers against her ear. For the first time, she didn't flinch. Instead, her golden eyes flickered open, locking onto his. A silent understanding passed between them. She was safe. For now. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around Alex as he shut the door behind him, blocking out the biting cold of the wilderness. His breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles screaming in exhaustion, but he didn't stop moving. The she-wolf, injured, bleeding, pregnant, lay in his arms, her weight pressing against his chest, her fur damp with melted snow and the crimson stains of her own suffering. He carefully lowered her onto the thick blankets near the fireplace, where the flames flickered and cast long, shifting shadows across the wooden walls. The moment her body touched the soft fabric, she let out a deep, trembling exhale, her ribs expanding with each ragged breath, as if her body could finally acknowledge the pain now that she was no longer fighting for her life in the snow. Alex worked fast, his pulse still pounding from the struggle in the forest. He grabbed his medical bag from the counter, pulling out antiseptic, gauze, sutures, and a syringe of painkillers. His fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled as he loaded the syringe. The she-wolf stirred weakly, her ears twitching, her golden eyes flickering open just enough to watch him. She was still afraid, still dangerous, despite her weakness. He spoke to her in a low, steady voice, hoping she would understand, even if only by the tone of his words. "I'm not going to hurt you, girl," he murmured, rolling up his sleeve to check the wound she had given him. Her teeth had gone deep. Blood seeped from the punctures in his forearm, staining the fabric of his shirt. He'd deal with it later. Right now, she was his priority. Her leg was a mess. The steel trap had done its damage, tearing through muscle, exposing raw tissue beneath the matted fur. Infection was a certainty if he didn't act fast. He moved carefully, reaching out to touch her injured limb. But the moment his fingers brushed the fur, she let out a low, warning growl. Her lips curled back just enough to expose a flash of teeth, her body tensing despite the exhaustion weighing her down. Alex froze, his pulse spiking, his instincts screaming at him to retreat. But he didn't move. He held her gaze, steady and unflinching, before slowly drawing back his hand. "I know you don't trust me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you don't have a choice. If I don't fix this, you'll die." She let out a heavy, shuddering breath, her body sagging again. She was too weak to fight anymore. Carefully, he injected the painkiller into her hind leg. She twitched but didn't resist. He watched her eyes, waiting for the telltale haze to take over as the drugs dulled her pain. When her breathing slowed, and her muscles loosened. He finally set to work. The hours passed in painstaking silence. He cleaned the wound, washing away the dried blood, cutting away the shredded fur to see the full extent of the damage. He worked quickly but methodically, his hands steady despite the tension coiled in his gut. The stitches took time, each thread pulling the torn skin together, each tug of the needle a reminder of how fragile life was. By the time he finished, his back ached, his fingers numb from the delicate precision the job required. She didn't move as he wrapped her leg in gauze, securing it tightly. The bleeding had slowed. That was something. Alex sat back on his heels, exhaling sharply as he ran a hand through his damp, sweat-matted hair. The fire crackled beside him, the warmth soaking into his skin, but it did nothing to ease the gnawing weight in his chest. He had saved her, but saving her was only half the battle. Now, she had to live. The days passed in a slow, tense rhythm. He monitored her wounds, changed her bandages, forced water down her throat when she was too weak to drink on her own. At first, she remained motionless, barely acknowledging his presence, except for the occasional flick of her ear when he moved too close. Her body was in survival mode, shutting down everything unnecessary to conserve energy. But then, on the third day, she tried to stand. It was weak, pitiful, her limbs shaking violently as she struggled to lift her body from the nest of blankets he had made for her. Alex moved to help, but the moment he approached, she let out a guttural growl, baring her teeth. He stopped in his tracks. Stubborn. Huh, he muttered, crossing his arms as he watched her collapse back onto the floor, her breathing heavy with exertion. Fine. Do it yourself. And she did. Over the next few days, she pushed herself, forcing her injured body to move, to adjust, to fight against the weakness threatening to consume her. Alex admired that. He recognized that fire. He had seen it before, in the animals he had treated, in the wounded creatures who refused to succumb. He decided then that she needed a name. Selena, he said one night, sitting by the fire, watching her as she rested. You look like a Selena. The she-wolf, Selena, did not react. Not at first. But then, her ear twitched slightly, just the barest movement, acknowledging his voice. It was the first sign of trust. By the second week, she was eating on her own. By the third, she was moving more fluidly, testing the limits of her bandaged leg. She no longer growled when he approached. Sometimes she even let him run his fingers through her thick fur, though she never lingered too long in his touch. The snow outside thickened, burying the landscape in an endless stretch of white. Alex stayed inside more often, tending to her, watching over her like a sentinel. One evening, as he sat at his small kitchen table, stitching up a tear in his jacket, he felt eyes on him. He turned his head slowly. Selena was watching him, not with fear, not with anger, just watching. A lump formed in his throat. You're getting used to me. Huh, he murmured. She blinked. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And for the first time in a long time, Alex didn't feel so alone. The storm outside was merciless, a howling beast of wind and ice that battered the small wooden cabin, its fury rattling the windows and piling snow against the doors in relentless drifts. The wilderness beyond was swallowed in an endless stretch of white, but inside, another battle was being fought, one far more primal, far more delicate, teetering on the thin line between life and death. The air was thick, heavy with tension and something raw, something ancient. The quiet urgency of birth, the whisper of instinct guiding life into the world. Selena was restless, her great body stretched across the thick blankets near the fireplace, her silver-gray fur damp with exertion, her sides heaving with shallow, labored breaths. The weight of her pregnancy had slowed her in recent days, her movements careful, deliberate, her golden eyes dark with something Alex recognized, pain, exhaustion, and something else, something deeper. A knowing. She was close. For hours she had paced, circling in slow, tight movements, her body responding to forces beyond conscious thought. But now, as the first rippling contraction clenched through her, she let out a low, guttural whimper and sank onto her side, pressing into the warmth of the blankets as her muscles tightened again, her limbs trembling under the strain. Alex was still watching, waiting. His body was exhausted, his arms still stiff from the wounds she had given him in her desperation weeks ago. But none of that mattered now. He had seen this before, many times, with domestic animals, with creatures brought into his care by desperate owners. But this was different. This was the wild, and he was an intruder in something sacred. Selena was allowing him to be here, allowing his presence in this most vulnerable of moments, and that alone was more trust than he had ever expected to earn from her. The next contraction racked her body, stronger this time, forcing a shuddering exhale from deep within her chest. Her powerful muscles flexed, her jaw tightening, her ears pinned back as she bore down, the firelight flickering across her sweat-slicked fur. And then, finally, with a small, wet gasp of sound, the first pup entered the world. A tiny, fragile thing, barely larger than Alex's palm, slick with fluid, its small body trembling as it struggled for its first breath. Selena reacted immediately, the exhaustion momentarily forgotten as instinct took hold. She twisted, licking the pup fiercely, clearing its airway, stimulating it into movement. A second later, the newborn let out a thin, reedy cry, its tiny mouth opening in protest as it squirmed against her warmth. One down. Alex exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Selena barely had time to rest before the next wave hit, her body bowing under the pressure of another contraction. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her teeth bared as she pushed through the pain. 2, 3, 4. One by one, they came, each one slipping into the world with the same fragile, mewling cries, their tiny bodies slick with birth, their fur damp and dark as Selena worked tirelessly to clean them, to nudge them toward the safety of her belly. Alex could only watch, awed by the sheer force of it, by the primal intensity of new life struggling against the cold grip of the world. By the time the fifth pup was born, Selena was trembling, her limbs weak, her golden eyes heavy with exhaustion. But she wasn't finished yet. The sixth and final pup came more slowly, its birth delayed, its arrival more strained than the others. Alex could see it immediately, the struggle, the danger. Selena whined, pushing harder, her body straining, her breaths growing sharper. But this one wasn't coming as easily. Alex tensed, ready to intervene if needed. But then, at last, with one final, shuddering effort, the pup was born. But it didn't move. The other 5 had taken their first breath instantly, their tiny bodies wriggling with the instinct to live. But this one was different. It was smaller, frilier, its little chest barely rising and falling. Selena nudged it with her nose, licking at its damp fur. But the tiny creature remained still, its breaths weak, its small mouth barely parting as it struggled to take in air. Alex didn't hesitate. He reached out carefully, his fingers brushing against Selena's fur as he lifted the newborn into his hands. Selena's head snapped up instantly, her golden eyes flashing, her ears pinned back. A low, exhausted growl rumbled from her throat, a warning, a last spark of instinctive protection for the tiny life she had just fought to bring into the world. Alex didn't back away. "Easy," he murmured, his voice steady, quiet. "She's not breathing right." Selena hesitated. Then, after a long, heavy moment, she lowered her head again, watching. A silent acceptance. Alex moved fast, rubbing the tiny pup between his hands, trying to coax warmth into its fragile body. He felt the delicate flutter of its heartbeat, too weak, too slow. He brought it close to his chest, letting his own body heat seep into it, his breath coming in quiet, whispered reassurances. "Come on, little one," he muttered. "Fight." Minutes passed, then a twitch, a small, broken whimper, the faintest movement. Alex let out a slow, shaky breath. "She's alive," he murmured. Selena watched him, her golden eyes unwavering. He wasn't sure how much she understood, but she didn't try to take the pup back right away. She simply stared at him, as if acknowledging that for now, for this moment, she trusted him. "She needs a name," Alex said softly, looking down at the tiny bundle in his hands. "Lila." The name came to him without hesitation. It fit. Carefully, he placed her back beside her mother, watching as Selena sniffed her, licking her tentatively before nudging her toward the warmth of her siblings. The storm still raged outside, the wind screaming through the trees, but inside, the world had shifted. Selena, the fierce survivor, had become a mother. Alex, the man who had once lived in solitude, had become something else entirely. And Lila, the weakest of them all, had been given a chance. As Alex sat back, exhaustion weighing heavy on his bones, he realized something profound. This wasn't just an act of survival. This was something else entirely. This was the beginning of something neither of them could have ever expected. The wilderness was never truly silent. Even in the dead of winter, beneath the thick blanket of snow that muffled sound and dulled movement, life pulsed in quiet, unseen ways. The wind whispered through the towering pines, carrying the scent of something distant, something ancient. The ice groaned under its own weight, and in the darkness beyond the cabin, just beyond the tree line where the world stretched vast and unknowable, the wolves called. It had started as a faint murmur days ago, a distant howl carried on the wind, barely more than an echo. Selena had lifted her head, ears twitching, but she had not moved. Not at first. She had remained curled around her pups, her golden eyes watchful, wary. But Alex had seen the shift in her even then, the slow unraveling of something he had no words for, the pull of a force older than time itself. Then the calls grew louder, the voices closer. No longer just an echo lost in the storm, but a presence, a tangible force pressing against the fragile walls of the cabin. The pack was searching. They had not forgotten her, and neither had she. Alex had noticed the change in her immediately. She was restless, pacing in slow, deliberate movements, her powerful body tense, alert. She ate less, her ears flicking at the slightest sound, her head lifting toward the window whenever the wind shifted. Even when she lay beside the fire, the warmth soaking into her thick fur, her muscles never fully relaxed. She was listening, waiting, for them. The pups were growing stronger, their tiny bodies no longer as fragile as they had once been, their fur thickening against the bite of winter's chill. Even Lila, the weakest among them, had begun to hold her own, her small form no longer trembling quite as much, her breaths no longer as fragile. But they were still helpless, still blind and unsteady, still bound to their mother for survival. They would not last in the wild. Not yet. Selena knew it. And yet, when the first true call came, deep, commanding, resonant in the frozen night, her entire body went rigid. Alex had been tending to the fire, his back turned, when the howl sliced through the stillness, low and guttural. Not a mere searching call, but something more. A summoning. Selena rose instantly, her ears pricked forward, her golden eyes wide, wild. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, her entire frame vibrating with something Alex could only describe as longing. Another howl followed, closer this time. Selena took a step toward the door. Alex moved instinctively, stepping between her and the exit, his breath visible in the cold air. "Selena," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension tightening his chest. She barely looked at him. Her focus was beyond the walls, beyond the human who had saved her, beyond the warmth and safety of the cabin. Her pack was here. She could feel them, smell them. They were waiting. The wind shifted again, and this time Alex smelled it too. The thick, musky scent of wolves, sharp and unmistakable. They were close. Selena took another step forward, her body taut, muscles coiled. She wasn't thinking anymore. Instinct was in control now, a force far greater than any bond they had forged in the past weeks. Alex swallowed hard, knowing what was coming. "You can't," he murmured. "Not yet." Her head snapped toward him then, her golden eyes flashing with something fierce, something desperate. She let out a low whine, a sound that sent a sharp pang through Alex's chest because for the first time, he realized she wasn't just fighting to leave. She was fighting herself. She was torn. Her pups were behind her, blind and fragile, their tiny bodies nestled against the warmth of the blankets where she had left them. They needed her still. They wouldn't survive without her. But her pack. They were calling her home. A third howl rang through the trees, closer, urgent. Selena let out a sharp breath, stepping back, her tail lashing behind her. She turned in a quick, frantic motion, as if pacing would somehow resolve the war raging inside her. Her paws pressed into the wooden floor, claws scraping slightly, her ears flicking between the cries of her pups and the howls outside. Then, suddenly a new sound, a rustling in the trees, a crunch of snow. Not just howls now. Movement. Alex felt his pulse spike. They weren't just calling anymore. They were coming. Selena froze again, her head tilting slightly, listening. The air was thick with tension, with the weight of something inevitable pressing down on both of them. Then, with a sharp inhale, she moved. Alex didn't have time to think. She lunged toward the door, her body a blur of silver and shadow, a streak of raw, untamed instinct. He reacted without hesitation. His hand shot out, grabbing her by the thick fur at the scruff of her neck, not with force, not to hurt, but to stop her just long enough for her to understand what she was about to do. Her body twisted sharply, her lips peeling back in an instinctive snarl, but when she turned, she didn't bite. Instead, she looked at him, truly looked at him, her golden eyes filled with something he couldn't name, something desperate, something almost pleading. "Selena," he murmured, his grip loosening slightly. "They'll take you back, but they won't take the pups." She flinched at the words, a tremor running through her powerful frame. Alex let go. She didn't move. From the nest of blankets, a weak cry. "Lila." Selena's head jerked back toward her, ears twitching at the tiny sound, her body swaying slightly, torn between the door and the tiny life that had barely made it into the world. Outside, another rustle. Then, just beyond the trees, the unmistakable glint of eyes in the darkness. They were here. Selena let out a long, shuddering breath, her body sagging slightly, her limbs trembling beneath her. Her pack had come for her, had followed the scent of her suffering, had waited for her to return. But she wasn't alone anymore. Slowly, shakily, she turned back to her pups. She stepped toward them, her nose nudging Lila's frail body, her tongue flicking out to clean the tiny pup as if grounding herself in the choice she had just made. The howls outside grew softer, questioning now, waiting. But Selena didn't answer. She curled back around her pups, pressing them close, her golden eyes staring unblinking at the door. The wind howled, the trees whispered, and the eyes in the darkness lingered. But they did not enter. And for the first time, the wolves outside were met with silence. The world had shifted, though Alex wasn't sure when he had first begun to feel it. Maybe it had been in the way the river had started to flow freely again, its ice breaking apart in jagged, drifting shards that tumbled downstream. Maybe it was in the softened earth beneath his boots, the scent of wet pine filling the air, the distant echo of birds that had long since abandoned the frozen wilderness, now returning to reclaim the sky. Or maybe it had always been inevitable, that nothing, not even the warmth of firelight and shelter, could keep the wild caged forever. Selena had been restless for weeks now. She no longer lingered near the hearth the way she once had, no longer stretched her powerful body along the blankets beside her growing pups. She moved differently now, sleeker, more fluid, her golden eyes sharper, more distant, more aware of something unseen beyond the walls of the cabin. It wasn't like the first time, when the howls of her pack had sent her into a trembling war between instinct and duty. This was something deeper, quieter, as though she already knew her decision but hadn't yet allowed herself to make it. Alex watched the signs, as he always had. The way she stood near the door for longer stretches, her ears flicking at the sounds beyond, her nose lifting to the wind that carried whispers of the world she had left behind. She no longer stirred when he moved through the cabin, no longer reacted with wary tension when he approached. She knew he wasn't a threat. She had known for a long time. But now, there was something else in the way she looked at him. A kind of understanding, a silent farewell before the words, or their absence, could make it real. The pups had grown strong, their once fragile bodies filling out, their fur thickening against the lingering chill of early spring. They no longer stumbled over their own limbs, no longer cried out in uncertainty when Selena stepped away from them. They followed her now, their playful yips turning into something more controlled, more disciplined. They were learning, even without realizing it, their tiny bodies already moving like creatures meant for the wild. Even Lila, the smallest, had changed. She still lingered behind the others, still moved with a careful deliberation rather than reckless abandon, but she had learned to hold her ground. When her siblings tackled her in their endless games of play fighting, she did not cower. She waited, watching, and then struck at just the right moment, sending them tumbling in surprise. She had learned patience, precision, a mind far keener than those around her. Selena had been watching too, and then, one evening, she made her choice. The sky burned with the colors of a setting sun, streaks of amber and crimson painting the treetops, stretching long shadows across the clearing. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, of thawing rivers, of something stirring just beyond sight. Selena stood at the threshold of the cabin, her sleek body framed against the golden light, her pups gathered at her feet. They weren't restless. They weren't confused. They knew. Alex leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had known, too. For a long time. She turned to him, just slightly golden eyes meeting his. There was no hesitation, no regret, but there was something else. Something that made Alex inhale slowly. Something that pressed deep into his ribs like a weight he hadn't prepared for. She stepped forward, not to leave, not yet, but toward him. Alex didn't move as she pressed her nose gently against his hand, her breath warm against his fingers, her body still, deliberate. She held there for a moment, just long enough for him to commit it to memory before pulling away. Then she turned and left. Her pups scrambled after her, their small bodies darting through the underbrush, their yips echoing softly as they disappeared into the trees. Only Lila hesitated. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her tiny frame poised between the warmth of what she had known and the wild promise of the unknown. Her dark eyes flicked toward Alex, her small ears twitching, her body still. Then, with a soft whimper, she turned and followed. The trees swallowed them whole. And then nothing. Alex stood there long after they had gone, the cold seeping into his skin despite the warmth of the evening air. He let out a slow breath, his fingers curling at his sides, pressing into the emptiness they had left behind. He had done his part. It was better this way. It had to be. The days stretched long after that, the cabin feeling larger than before, the silence pressing in where the soft sounds of pause and quiet breathing had once filled the space. He kept busy, he always had, but there was something different now. He no longer woke in the night expecting to hear movement by the fire. He no longer found tufts of fur clinging to the blankets or the faint imprints of tiny paws in the drying mud by the door. But some nights, when the wind shifted just right, when the world beyond the trees grew quiet, he found himself listening. Until one evening, the silence broke. It was subtle at first, just a whisper of movement beyond the clearing, the rustle of underbrush disturbed by something not quite unseen. Alex felt it before he heard it, an old instinct that prickled at the edge of his awareness. Something familiar, something waiting. Then, from the shadows, she emerged. Selena. She moved differently now, sleeker, stronger, the hesitation of her recovery gone, replaced by something unmistakable. A leader's grace, a predator's certainty. But she wasn't alone. Dark shapes lingered behind her, shifting between the trees, silent, waiting. Wolves. Her pack. Alex felt his breath catch. They had accepted her. And at her side, no longer small, no longer fragile, stood 6 young wolves, their fur sleek, their eyes bright. They had survived, and among them, standing just slightly apart, her dark eyes unwavering, was Lila. Still smaller than the rest, still leaner but different now. She was no longer the weakest. She was something else entirely. Selena watched him for a long moment, the space between them stretching like something untethered, something unspoken. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. Alex didn't move. She came close, close enough that he could see the way her fur had thickened, close enough to hear the steady rhythm of her breath, close enough that when she stopped, her golden eyes locking onto his, there was no mistaking what she was telling him. She had not forgotten, and she had come back, not because she needed him, not because she was lost, but because he was part of the story now. Then, just as silently, she turned and disappeared back into the trees. This time, Alex didn't watch her leave. This time, he knew. She would return. The years passed, and the wilderness changed as it always did, shifting with the slow, deliberate hand of nature. The rivers carved deeper paths through the land, their currents steady and unyielding. The forests thickened in some places, thinned in others, shaped by time, by fire, by the restless movement of creatures that claimed the land as their own. Seasons came and went, sweeping over the landscape like an artist's brush, painting it in the stark whites of winter, the rich greens of summer, the burning golds of autumn. But some things remained. The cabin still stood, weathered but strong, nestled between towering pines, its wooden frame worn smooth by wind and rain. Inside, the fire still burned on cold nights, casting long, shifting shadows against the walls, filling the space with warmth and the scent of pine and aged timber. And outside, in the vast, untamed wild, a presence still lingered, a whisper of something ancient, something enduring. Selena's legacy had not faded. Alex had never sought recognition, had never thought of his actions as anything more than instinct, duty, a quiet obligation to a world that had long since stopped expecting kindness from men. He had saved her because she needed saving. He had protected her pups because they had deserved a chance. He had stepped aside when the time had come, understanding that no matter how deep their bond, the wild could not be tamed, nor should it be. But the world had taken notice. It had started with whispers among the local wildlife researchers, stories of a lone veterinarian living deep in the forests of British Columbia, a man who had done what no one else dared to do. He had not just rescued a wolf. He had earned her trust. He had not just rehabilitated her. He had helped her return to the wild without breaking her connection to the life she had left behind. The first time they came, Alex had met them at the edge of his property, arms crossed, expression unreadable as a group of biologists stepped cautiously onto the clearing, their cameras and notebooks clutched tightly, their eyes filled with quiet curiosity. They had questions. So many questions. How had he done it? How had he kept her alive? How had she come back? Alex had never considered the how of it before. It had just happened. The choices had made themselves. The trust had built itself, slow and careful, a thing earned rather than given. They're not meant to be controlled, he had said simply, leaning against the worn wooden railing of his porch. You help them how you can, and then you let them go. It was a philosophy that to many seemed impossible. Conservation efforts had long relied on distance, on the belief that human interference should be minimal, clinical, detached. But what Alex had done, what Selena had proven, was that trust was not interference. It was something else entirely. The research teams began to follow her pack, tracking their movements, documenting their behavior. What they found astounded them. Selena and her offspring were different. They did not fear humans the way other wolves did, yet they did not depend on them either. They did not linger near settlements, did not scavenge, did not seek food where food was not meant to be found. But they watched, observed, and sometimes they returned. The first time Selena had come back, it had been just her golden eyes peering through the trees, her presence a quiet acknowledgement, a reassurance that she had not forgotten. But over the years, others came. The pups Alex had helped raise were no longer pups. They had grown, had found their own places within the pack, had carved out their own destinies in the vast, endless stretch of the wilderness. Yet something had remained tethered between them, some thin, unbreakable thread of connection. Lila was the first of the offspring to step into the clearing alone. She was no longer small, no longer fragile. She moved with the same quiet grace her mother had once carried, her dark eyes sharp, intelligent. She did not approach as Selena had, did not press her nose to his hand in silent thanks, but she lingered, her presence a question, an answer, all at once. She stayed for hours that first time, watching as Alex moved about the cabin, as he chopped wood, as he sat on the porch and stared out into the fading light of dusk. Then, as the stars began to prick through the sky, she turned and vanished back into the trees. She came again a year later, and then again, not often, not regularly, but enough. The researchers had been baffled. Wolves did not do this. They did not return to places they had left behind. They did not acknowledge humans beyond fear or avoidance. And yet, time and time again, Selena's pack defied every expectation. Their presence not a cry for help, not a plea for food or safety, but a silent reminder that the bond forged in those long, brutal winter months had never truly broken. The way conservationists approached rehabilitation began to shift. Programs were developed based on trust rather than avoidance, on understanding rather than detachment. Selena's name was spoken in studies, in lectures, in documentaries that sought to unravel the mystery of the wolf who had bridged the gap between man and nature without ever losing herself to either world completely. But to Alex, she was never a mystery. She was just Selena, and he knew, deep in his bones, that no matter how many years passed, no matter how many seasons turned over themselves in their endless cycle, she would always be out there, watching, waiting, and when the time was right, she would return.